Okay, hey everyone, welcome to episode 24 of the Technology for Good show. Guest on the show today is Jeremiah Stone. Jeremiah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me on, Tom. It's been a while since we talked. It's good to be chatting with you again, and I'm excited about the technology for good format. And since you brought me on, I was able to force myself to watch a bunch of the Hangouts, and it's really neat format. I currently serve as the Chief Technology Officer for software for General Electric Energy Management, and GE is a big place, lots of businesses. The energy management business is our electrical power business. And that contains things like our transmission and distribution portfolio, our protection and control, switchgear, breakers, that sort of thing, our intelligent platforms portfolio, which is a pretty big operational technology software group, and then our power conversion business, which takes motive power and turns it into electricity. Electricity turns it into motive power. So my responsibility is as part of our industrial internet strategy at General Electric to work across all of those businesses together with our software center of excellence, which we have here in San Ramon, beautiful sunny San Ramon, California, and help to lead and drive our strategy across that business. So I've been in the role for about 5 months now, so still very much learning an awful lot about a very big, challenging business, but having a lot of fun.
Sure. I mean, this has to be an interesting time with a lot of changes in the electricity business.
It's fascinating. I mean, the rate of change and disruption to our traditional customers, and in our business, energy management, I have a colleague who jokes that our business goes from turbine to toaster. It kind of goes across the entire gamut, and you see amazing change just at every single layer of that. Whether we're talking about generation, where there's a huge change away from coal to natural gas if you're looking at the fossil industry, but also large-scale renewables, distributed renewables. That gets down into transmission and distribution world. Then down at the local level, some of the stories we'll be talking about today, empowering you and me, regular people, to manage energy. And so the multiple variables of change simultaneously is just every day is a new day, and just when you think you've got something figured out, somebody pops up doing something that completely changes the landscape. So we really see this convergence of big machines and intelligent machines and lots of data and smart people. As we call it, I think brilliant minds, brilliant machines, lots of data, and that's all coming together into a very rapidly changing, challenging mix. So it's a really neat place to be.
Yeah, it's cool. I mean, it's an industry I've been watching for about 8 years now. I started looking into the industry around 2006, I think it was, and it's been stagnant and stalled for decades. And there was a bit of movement, around 2006 to 2008. There seemed to be a little bit of movement, but then everything died off again for a couple of years with the crisis and all. No funding, but in the last 2 years, I think a lot of it has been developing some technology as well. There have been huge leaps, and even things like, and as you mentioned, we'll get to some of the stories later on, but some of the things like home area networks and storage and things like that, they've jumped orders of magnitude in the last couple of years, and they're enabling massive changes. But we'll power on. We'll get to those stories now, because we're 4 minutes in and we have a ton of stories to try and race through. So the first story that I wanted to get to, and the format of the show is always that we start with a kind of climate-based story, just to kind of set a bit of context. And the first story that I saw that I thought was interesting was this one about a polar vortex in July in the US. That's apparently record cold weather on its way to the US, and it's coming down out of the north. And you're safe enough there, Jeremiah, in California, where you're actually in one of the hottest weeks of the year, apparently. But up in the northeast, and you can see it on the map here, the temperatures are due to plummet. Now, it says a polar vortex. It's more like a polar vortex type of weather front, not an actual polar vortex. We're not going to get snow and ice or anything like that, but the temperatures are going to drop down from what they would typically be this this time of year. We're in July, for God's sake. We should be having sweltering weather. So apparently, I guess this is all part of the kind of global weirding that we're seeing as a result of climate change, Jeremiah.
Yeah, this is part and parcel with that discussion. And in the article you mentioned, they say simultaneously we'll be experiencing our hottest temperatures, really, potentially ever in certain parts of the globe. Here in California, we're, probably in about a 150-year drought. So we could certainly use, a return to more normal weather patterns. There was some big hope about El Nino for this year, that we could get, some more moisture flow here. I think that the big concern that this plays on a deeper level, and we talked about how the technology industry changes or doesn't, is that, all weather is really local. And if you look at that map, that covers a really broad swath of what constitutes the U.S. electorate and sort of the heartland of the United States. And as we start to have hopefully a more sophisticated and science-based discussion around global warming and around climate change, these sorts of events tend to really decrease the quality of the conversation, because people will remember, oh, it was cool last summer. Not that we had historically variable or high rates of change. In fact, that actually, this is what the data shows us, right? Is if you look at how humans perceive this thing, we tend to be on an extremely short scale. We have the Long Now Institute out here, Stuart Brand, et cetera, thinking we need to think on the orders of not decades, but centuries, and looking at data differently. And, that's one thing that we continue to be challenged by in the sustainability community, or more broadly, is just framing the conversation appropriately. And I can't, I can wait. Unfortunately, I think I won't have to wait to see the conversation be, well, it was really cool this summer. What are you talking about?
Yeah. I guess the term global warming doesn't help the conversation. Climate change is probably more accurate. I remember John Holdren, Barack Obama's science advisor, saying the more accurate expression would be climatic. What was it? I've forgotten it now. No, it was something about enormous climatic change, and basically he was saying it would be more accurate, but doesn't kind of trip off the tongue the same way.
You can't even remember, right? So, just the conversation around the whole thing is a real challenge, and we tend to have good language financially to talk about volatility of commodities, that sort of thing. Volatility of weather patterns is more difficult because it's not something that people have the same sorts of tools or sophistication to think about. We sort of exist in such a narrow band of survivability, and people don't really think about the volatility right now. Now that said, a lot of the industries that we tend to work with are thinking about this sort of thing, and there is regulatory response. Interestingly enough, not so much to carbon or things like that are broadly agreed by the scientific community to be root causes, but more on the adaptability side. So looking at reliability, looking at resiliency in the face of that sort of change and variability or volatility. And once that kind of money starts being spent, one perceives or believes that the deeper discussion about getting at the root causes can perhaps come with it, but we'll see.
Yeah. We'll move on to some of the other stories, and there were 3 stories I thought that were interesting around this kind of space, and they're around renewables particularly. And the first one was that Timberland, the clothing company, and I'm wearing one of their shirts right now, they cut their greenhouse gas emissions 50%, and they surpassed their renewable energy goal 2 years early. And they cut their greenhouse gas emissions 50% basically by increasing the amount of renewable energy they were using. The second story I wanted to get into in this kind of space was around how batteries and storage are now starting to make a big kind of dent in this space. And this is a story by Katie Fernbecker on GigaOhm. And basically she was saying that she was at this Intersolar North America show, which is a big solar show in the Moscone Center in San Francisco. And at the show, the battery companies were out in force, and they were getting a lot of interest, apparently. And then the third story in this area back to, again, more on the solar, is around Apple building a third solar farm near its North Carolina data center. So we're starting to see, lots more interest, I think. Maybe that's just the fact that I cherry-picked the stories, but we're starting to see an increased awareness of and usage of renewables, I think. What do you think, Jeremiah?
I think it goes back to the initial conversation, where we're starting to see an increased rate of change in the energy industry as such. I think we're in a period where the regulatory stance is very much, or the pendulum swings back and forth, right? And the pendulum right now, if you look at where the regulatory stance is right now, it's a looser, broader, let's say more risk friendly stance from the regulator point of view, and that is being friendly to things like net metering, tariffs, or other financial incentives that allow the capital investment that is around putting up a big solar farm, putting batteries in your basement. Dean Kamen just came out with his Stirling engine discussion about what we could do around that, and basically allows the financial modeling for these infrastructure investments to look interesting to the non-utility. On the other hand, what that creates simultaneously is the risk of stranded capital on the utility side, where you have these 30 or 40 year multi-decade investment paybacks. So I think at the moment we're in one of these swings where the regulators are encouraging more interesting, or let's say risky from the sense that it's new technologies, more ambitious or adventurous forays into distributed generation. The question is how long that can last from a regulator point of view, given that as you start to see more distributed generation, obviously you're having then what the Rocky Mountain Institute refers to as grid defection. People are able to actually step off of the grid, step off of the utility load, which in essence is going to force the utility to recapture their investments via the distributed consumer. And the question in everybody's mind is how far can that go? Because at some point you then start to ask, should I be subsidizing Apple's solar farm if I'm a normal utility consumer? Because suddenly Apple doesn't have to buy bulk electricity from their local utility there. And I think that's going to be an interesting thing to watch play out. But at the moment, there doesn't seem to be a big focus on the regulatory side to shift back towards a more utility-friendly stance. And the only place where you see that really is around security, rather than on the financial side. And that's where the regulators are focusing quite a bit, is around cybersecurity, et cetera.
Yeah, and I guess there's a lot of good reason for that. I mean, I saw a report this week saying that something like 70% fully of the utility companies had been hacked into in the last year alone. And a lot of that has to be down to the fact that they're becoming more connected and more digitized. They are big targets, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and as we have watched instability in places like, Ukraine and others, you see the actual deployment of cyber attacks towards infrastructure targets is not a hypothetical thing anymore. This is actually happening. And as a result, I think that's where there is a lot of focus. And it's funny because you have this happening at the same time that everybody's starting to look at the cloud and other opportunities for IT cost arbitrage or even new use cases that we can't support. At the same time, you have things playing out that happened several years ago. But this is the way the regulatory process works, and the way that industry processes work is you look at things like Stuxnet in Iran, or even the cyber attacks in Saudi Arabia and in Qatar that happened, I guess 2 years ago now. Now you're starting to see the pressure around unidirectional networking, data diodes at the operational level, those sorts of things. And now the new NIST cybersecurity standards coming out, and people starting to make some pretty aggressive interpretations of NERC-CIP regulations or just regulatory papers, and that pendulum seems to be very much swinging back the other direction, and it's a dialogue that is being had behind closed doors. Certain vendors are pushing that. Certainly fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It's a good opportunity to sell lots of kit for some people. It's a challenge. GE's, one of the things that we've been doing in this area recently is really looking at ways that you can be auditable, ways that you can be transparent to try to continue to drive the conversation forward. Because that whole distributed load and renewables conversation sort of relies on these technologies, right? It relies on abilities to transfer information, to shed or share load across these areas. And so, we've got the World Tech. They produce the Achilles certification, but this is an area that the whole industry is totally lacking. And auditability is an assurance around security protocols and so on is really poor right now. And so, regulators are in a tough spot.
Yeah, we're very much at the start of a lot of this connectivity of utilities, networks, and anytime you're at the start of anything like that, there will always be issues, I guess, is the easiest way to put it. And it'll take a while for the market to mature and for the networking protocols to come on board and for the organizations to be completely battened down. And it doesn't help when you've got state actors jumping in the fray and developing cyber weapons.
You have to actually start thinking about nation-state level attacks, and that's a really interesting. It's a very concerning reality. And as you said, these systems are starting to all become networked and interconnected. We talked about the smart grid, but the initial phases of the smart grid was really the meter on the side of your house, and it was one direction. But now we have to get bidirectional. We have to get bidirectional flow. It's happening. Now, I have a customer that gets backflow on feeder lines. In certain regions of Australia due to the high penetration of photovoltaic, and we're only going to be able to manage that sort of thing with the ability to have tight, almost SCADA-like control across these distributed resources. But that's not going to happen in a traditional sense because there's not going to be one actor owning these things, and so you have to be able to plug them in and interconnect them. The challenge right now is that most efforts have been on a subsystem level. So a system of systems or a cross-system, architecture or standard for security is really emergent. We're working very hard around that. Others are as well. But if you think about it, that's where a lot of these attacks are coming from, is they're transverse attacks. So you find a weak point, and then you do transversal attacks behind what were perceived to be safe entry points. And that's one of the biggest challenges that we face.
We'll get there. It'll just take time. You mentioned cloud, and there were a couple of cloud stories this week that we wanted to get to as well. And the first one that I saw was this one that Google are now offering cloud storage at virtually free. So it's part of the cloud wars between Google, Microsoft, and AWS, Amazon Web Services. And we see that they're now going to, through a partner, offer, I think it's 2 terabytes of free storage. And so, I mean, that's pretty phenomenal, it has to be said. And then, as well as that, we saw Amazon going after Box, Dropbox, and Huddle, launching this thing called Zocalo, which is secure enterprise storage. So basically, it's like Box or Dropbox, but for enterprise. And the third story I saw, slightly still related to cloud, but a slightly different take, not quite the storage wars, but Google, Microsoft, IBM, and others are collaborating to make managing Docker containers easier. So three cloud-related stories there. 2 basically around the pricing race to the bottom, and the other one around moving information between cloud providers. No great shock that Amazon aren't part of the Docker initiative, I guess. Everyone wants to have portability between cloud providers except Amazon, for obvious reasons.
Well, what do you make of it? I mean, there is a interesting, as you say, who has made the biggest capex investment in these, infrastructure as a service and platform as a service are the 3, right? I mean, we've got Google, we've got Amazon, and we've got Microsoft. But those three companies have such wildly different core business models. It's really interesting to see, how they're playing that out. I mean, I have some thoughts about that, but I mean, how do you see that evolving?
Honestly, I have no idea. I mean, you saw Satya Nadella put out his memo yesterday on where he wants the company to go, and he's moving away from services and onto platforms. So they're very much chasing down the whole platform side of things. Amazon just want to own everything. Is my take on it. And Google, they're different. I mean, they've got a different model. Their model is around data. You've got Apple in the mix as well. Slightly, they're more a consumer play than a business play, and they just want everyone who has any Apple Kit to have their stuff stored on Apple Kit. The interest I have in it, I guess, is goes back to the renewables thing that we talked about a minute ago, because Apple are 100% renewable, Microsoft are 80% directly from renewables, but they say that by the end of this year they'll be 100% from renewables directly. For 2013, they were 80% directly from renewables and 20 from offsets. So they were 100% green, but not entirely directly renewables. So by the end of 2014, they'll be 100% directly from renewables. Google are next best, coming in at around just under 40% from renewables, and then Amazon, God knows, they don't report on anything. So they're probably mostly coal. They have, well, their data centers aren't in Seattle. Most of them aren't. They're in Virginia, for example, and places like that. They probably have one in Seattle. They have said that their Gov Cloud and Oregon Cloud are 100% renewable, but then when questioned on that, they've not come back with any details on that. Why aren't they reporting? And even in Oregon, I mean, Pacificor, who are one of the big utility companies in Oregon, they mine 9 million tons of coal per annum. They own several big mines. AWS, the best we can say about them is we don't know. The others, as I say, Google are close to 40%. 38 was the last figure I saw for Google on renewables. Microsoft 80 with 20 offset, going to 100 this year. And then, as I said, we have Apple at 100, but they're a consumer play. And then you've Green Cloud, who are based out of Iceland, they build themselves as an AWS drop-in, and they're at 100, obviously, because they're based out of Iceland. Mm. Now, that's a very different answer to the question you asked.
It's relevant, though. I mean, it is technology for good, right? And from the point of view of not externalizing these things, I think it is important as compute and energy. Compute acquires more and more of our load. It's a realistic and reasonable question to ask. I think from my point of view, I am really, I'd almost say, blown away by the sea change at Microsoft with Satya Nadella. I've not been a long-term Microsoft fan at all. I've always been a back-end. My first operating system that I could do anything on was Solaris. I worked back at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. I was doing turbulence detection and real-time weather modeling. And in Boulder, and every time I tried to do anything with Microsoft technology, it was big, it was monolithic, it was my way or the highway, it wasn't flexible or anything. I had the pleasure, luck, privilege of the position to go up to Redmond recently and attend an executive briefing, and I think the overarching theme from Microsoft is it's humble. It's open, looking to win sort of the next wave of the, let's say, the compute infrastructure wars on the basis of merit, not on the basis of extension of platform, or let's see, even savvy business maneuvering, as has been done in the past with the Gates and Ballmer years, and find out things like 30% of the Azure load are Linux VMs. They're taking an aggressive microservices-based architecture that you can do things with their compute environment in a highly automated and scalable way that Amazon won't let you do, because Amazon's very, very cookie cutter, and you have to live within their world. And Google's, both Amazon and Google's terms and conditions are challenging, to say the least, from an enterprise perspective in terms of who owns the data and where is the liability. And I was just really surprised at how, let's say, open and careful Microsoft is being about this. And I read once, Microsoft is always at their most dangerous when everybody is ignoring them. And right now, everybody is pretty much ignoring Azure, and it's Google, it's Amazon, and of course people are also ignoring Oracle and SAP and the others who have huge compute as well, but more focused niche. I thought there must be ice skating in Hades when I saw the Kubernetes announcement from Microsoft, Red Hat, IBM. These people do not come together, and usually when they do come together, it's to slow each other down, to not do anything meaningful. But if you look at Docker, I mean, I just love Docker. It's just such a neat, it's such a community-oriented and meaningful project to allow us to really cut out the pain of just the silliness of setting up an environment, right? And how painful it is to set up an environment, when moving from development to production. It just shouldn't be that hard. And I think it's a great project, and I definitely applaud those companies coming together. And as you look at these hyperscale providers building out, I'd say don't ignore Microsoft, because the attitude there is very, very different. They may not have won a lot of the base load search with Bing, but they learned an awful lot. And you can't also underestimate what they're doing with Xbox and how they're learning from Xbox and putting that into other environments. And that's another area where you start to think about compute and shed and load and tech for good, is if you start to have that type of connectivity of looking at an appliance inside the home and inside the cloud. If you look at 80 acres, I don't know if you've read about what Microsoft did with their campuses and that. Just unbelievably interesting stuff. So again, hey, I don't want to go off on a tear, but I've always been a huge Microsoft critic, and I wouldn't say I'm converted, but I'm definitely impressed by the road they've traveled, and I'm really interested to see where Satya takes them and how they're able to, let's say, redeem their image, because I definitely was not a fan.
Yeah, no, likewise. I mean, I've been a Microsoft user for quite a long time. Back in the early 2000s, I was a Windows sysadmin and network admin. So I know their systems quite well, and but I haven't used Active Directory or Exchange or SQL Server now. I haven't gone down and dirty with them in a number of years, but I was able to do that. So I've known their systems for quite a while. The Ballmer years has seen the company languish quite a bit, but since Satya has taken over, and it's only 5 months ago, he has, I think, re-energized the organization, and he's made a couple of bold steps. Like Ballmer always said, he would never put Office on iOS, and within, I think it was 3 weeks of Nadella taking over, Office on iOS was released. And then they released it on Android, and they still haven't released a decent version on Windows Phone yet. They're going to where the users are rather than expecting the users to come to them, which is as you say, a seed change, and it's interesting to see. Their Azure offering is extremely good, as you've said, and very open. So I think, yeah, they've realized that they need to go to where the consumers are and not try and force everyone to come to them, which is a new outlook from Microsoft, and it's heartening to see. As you say, they've become more humble, and frankly, it's not before time. let's be honest.
It's not for lack of good reason. If you look what their share price has done, etc. But yeah, Nadella, Guthrie, the whole Azure, Xbox, Bing crowd, they've been out there competing on the merits with these other players, and I think there still is a big Windows camp, and it's probably how you can talk about it, is sort of the Azure Bing Xbox camp, and then the Windows camp, and I think there are still those factions, if you will. It's a big company, but there's definitely a totally different vibe if you look at Guthrie and Nadella, some of the leaders they have now, and man, smart people working really hard. So definitely more to watch for there. I'm sure you'll have more stories from them on Tech for Good in the future.
Look, yeah, looking forward to it. We'll power ahead, and the next couple of stories are more kind of around communications and data. And I saw this nice one about how Google's Waze application, and Waze is kind of a GPS application for the phone. It'll plot routes for you, and when you're driving, it'll tell you, if there's an accident ahead, or if you come across an accident, you can report it so that everyone else sees it. So it's like community GPS. And what they're doing now, and not just them, but what they're doing now is they're selling their traffic information into city governments. So Rio de Janeiro are buying that information from them, and they're also getting it from Move It, which is a cycling application, and Strava as well. So Strava and Move It are used by joggers, by cyclists, by people out walking. And this information is now, these companies are now selling that information back to cities, which is really interesting. It's anonymized information, so it means that you're not being personally identified, and the city isn't able to track you as an individual. What it is people can, or the cities can watch traffic flows of cars, of bikes, of pedestrians, runners, whatever, and see if there are bottlenecks and adjust accordingly. Maybe adjust their public transport mechanisms because people are going a different way to the way they thought. We talk about wearables a lot. Switching topics for a second, we talk about wearables a lot on this show, and I saw Adidas have come out with another wristband with information on it. It is, I wear a Fitbit Force. The Adidas one that they're showing here is a little more advanced. It's got heartbeat monitoring in it and a decent application, a decent iOS and Android application. So you can get information around, as I said, heartbeat. So when you're exercising, you'll see if your heartbeat is raising and so on. So that's all very well. And the next story I wanted to talk to, no, we'll hold off on that. We'll come back to that in a second. So the Adidas, I think that's kind of a Me Too story. The Waze and Move It and Strava selling their data, though, I think that's an interesting one. It was a reasonably obvious one, given that mobile phone companies have had this data for a while, and while they haven't monetized it, I've seen it used a couple of times. There was an interesting story out of the Ivory Coast in Africa, where there was a competition held on data use, and this was one use case of it. It was to use mobile phone data to help public transport mechanisms, for example. So it's a use of the data that we are pushing out there from our devices that might not be obvious to us, but when these applications are typically free, as has often been noted, we become the product.
No, I mean, I think these are awesome stories. These are really cool talks about crowdsourcing and doing data with the crowdsourced information. And I typically don't sign in. I was thinking about this, that I don't use Chrome a lot. I tend to stay away from applications that can identify me in general. Just as a basic philosophy, I'm pretty privacy oriented. But I love Waze. Waze is an app that I use on a regular basis because the quality of the user experience is excellent, and they've done some really nice design ideas in terms of telling me when I'm going to get home. And I just moved to the Oakland Hills, and I work in San Ramon, and there's two routes that I can take. Right? I can either go north through Walnut Creek, or I can go south through the Dublin Pleasanton area or I can go through really small roads in the hills there, and it's very unpredictable. Either way could be good at any given time, and I find that Waze is really a superior experience for helping me to get to work in the morning. And they, like you said, it's crowdsourced, so people are able to identify, accidents or other things. You could say that's not good because they're encouraging cell phone use while driving, to say, oh, something is wrong here. We hope it's just passengers doing the reporting of the accidents and so on, and not drivers. But the quality of experience is really good. Similarly, I'm a big Strava fan. I really like Strava for cycling. Because they again, what did they do? Crowdsourcing. They crowdsource essentially competition or racing because they maintain leaderboards for segments. Wherever you want to ride, they crowdsource the creation of routes. And out here in the Bay Area, cycling is very big, and so people will create a route for their own ride to track their performance over the ride. And there's various, you can connect it to your Garmin cycling computer as well as your heart rate monitor, so you can see how did I do on that segment, etc. And so they do a very good job there of creating a virtual leaderboard for these various segments. So who's doing the climb the fastest, and they've had some challenges for that, because of course who's doing the descent the fastest can create an unsafe situation where people are essentially competing at a given time. But you have a almost asynchronous racing now over these spaces. So big fans of both of the apps. I think sharing those now with infrastructure providers, I think it's just a great idea, because if an infrastructure provider now can see, oh, there's a lot of cyclists on this given road, for example with Strava, maybe we'll adjust our road repair strategy, or maybe we'll adjust our lane or shoulder width strategy so that we
put in the cycle lane.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty neat, that they can do that. And both applications provide publicly available, as you point out, in some cases anonymized feeds. So I think it's great. We just had a big customer into the software center here yesterday, and that was one of the questions they asked us. From a utility point of view, how can we crowdsource information more effectively? Because humans are effectively the most intelligent distributed sensing network that we have. And often we talk about technology, but what makes Strava interesting, what makes Waze interesting, isn't necessarily the technology. It's pretty rudimentary technology, actually. What's interesting is the human component of those systems, and I think both companies have done a really good job of designing for the human and bringing the human interaction and data in. From a wearables point of view, I'm a Basis guy.
Right.
I use the Basis biometrics. I think it's fascinating to see the increase of sensing technology that it's available to the consumer. And utilization there, and I wonder, as we start to see this go forward, when will we start to be able to opt into data sharing with our healthcare providers?
Absolutely. I mean, that's going to be huge, and you can see all of the providers are, at least all of the mobile platform providers are getting into it. You've got your health app coming from Apple, you've got Google Fit on the Android side, even Samsung have got one, Microsoft have got their Health Vault, I think it's called. That's going to be a massive change, I think, and I see in time the likes of an extension of the EMR, the medical record, where we own a vault of our information, and then we tick off who gets access to what slices of that information from time to time. You mentioned sensors and people, and I gave a talk at our IoT, our Internet of Things conference in December last year in London, and it was on that exact topic. The title of the talk was "People as Sensors," and it was just because, yes, with these devices we are pushing out all kinds of information. And it's not just these devices either, and the Fitbits and things like that, but it's also for example, one of the topics I talked about was using asthma inhalers, and there was a device called Asmopolis, which was an inhaler which had a GPS and timestamp built into it. So every time you gave a puff of your inhaler, it was GPS and time-stamped. And it also had a Wi-Fi connector in it, so you then could push that information to an app, and also that app could then share, you choose to share that information or not with your doctor, but also with the local authorities. So there was one city, I think it was Lewisburg, it was in Kentucky, where they had a pollution issue, and they were able to see who was using their inhalers where. They weren't able, it was anonymized data, so they weren't able to see individuals, but they were able to see when inhalers were being used and where, so they could get a map of pollution in the city and how it was affecting people, which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah, and another one that's not on your list here that I learned about recently is I think it was National Grid in New York area.
Right.
They had a program where they were handing out Band-Aids to school children that you could scratch and sniff the Band-Aid, and it gave off a smell like natural gas, and basically saying, if you smell this smell, tell an adult, because actually children, travel in places that other people don't, and they actually occupy a different, geographic space than adults, and they, their sense of smell is better, etc. And apparently they've been, really successful in identifying, leaks that because you've got this aging infrastructure, pipes that go back to Abraham Lincoln or whatever. And in our case, and in Europe, it's even further, right?
Yeah.
And as we start to see natural gas penetration, increase, the load on the existing infrastructure will go up. But it's, I think, a beautiful example of a relatively low-tech way of increasing the use of humans as sensors. And onboarding, that type of data, and I think that's just a hugely untapped market. Now the question is, go back to the question with the healthcare and so on. We've yet to come to really find a way. I mean, like I said, I'm a basis guy. This tracks, perspiration, heart rate. It's a great pedometer and so on and so forth. But I haven't changed my behavior as much as I would have liked after having fun. I think that same problem is at the core of what we're doing here, with our predictivity solutions, for example, of trying to help companies change their behavior. But I think that's one area that we all need to improve on. And I wonder if you go back to the healthcare example, I would probably change my behavior if my healthcare premium every month were dependent upon how many times I'd been under a consumption calorie threshold, or at least a utilization calorie threshold. I remember when I was in Europe. I lived in Germany for about 4.5 years. There was a penalty for your body mass index. I had to pay more because I wasn't as fit as apparently they deemed I ought to be. So I was carrying a higher risk. I thought that was, as an American, I was really offended by that. But I sort of suspect that's where we're headed. Is baselining premiums on the basis of your behavior. Do you smoke? What's your BMI? And then looking at sensing technology to identify if you're being proactive around that. But the social changes that have to happen in order to enable that are going to be huge. And the business side of the world, I think we have better levers from a business perspective, and that's stuff that we've talked about in the sustainability world for a long time, is incenting behavior and finding the way that that it's a false dichotomy to say that you can have a profitable good business and be sustainable. The whole Bill McDonough live in a world of abundance philosophy, which I think we certainly believe in. But I think at the personal level, it's really encouraging to see that, because I think at the individual human level, when those change, then you'll get better change at the broader scale.
True. We'll plow on. The next story in a different space I saw was around it's the kind of communications, and it's how YouTube are now publicly shaming internet providers for slow video. So basically, and Netflix apparently is doing the same thing. Not much to this story except to say, kudos to them for doing that. They're not doing it here in Europe yet, but the sooner they do, the better, because the internet here in Spain is atrociously slow. Different kind of communications, but more transport. There are now apparently more charge point electric vehicle charging stations in the US than there are McDonald's. There's about 13,000 McDonald's in the US, and ChargePoint just put out their 18,000th EV charging station. So that speaks really to a massive change in the potential for a shift in transport and the modes of transport in the US, and a shift away from ICE. internal combustion engines and to EVs, potentially. The biggest difficulty with electric vehicles has always been the range issue, and if there are enough chargers around the place, and a lot of them are actually free, I know they are here anyway, if they're free or cheap, it does away with a lot of the range anxiety with electric vehicles.
Yeah, definitely. Interesting to put those two stories together. I was, looking at that, thinking, okay, do you start to then think about, infrastructure as a service, and kind of going back to that question about, what does that mean? When we think about that as the storage story that we talked about earlier, that it becomes, nearly impossible to earn money providing infrastructure as a service when it's storage. When you start to look at bandwidth, the tiering and the consumption of that information. Obviously, when the carriers, when Verizon, AT&T, and others built out their networks, when you build out your fixed infrastructure, they didn't even, Netflix, YouTube, they had no, concept that you'd have this volume of video data going across these networks, and so they just didn't plan for it. It's not in the existing build out even. And then of course, in the years of dark fiber, then others like Google went in and bought up a lot of the fiber that's out there in your local, even local ISPs or even investor groups have bought this stuff up. So clearly, the carriers are in a pickle because their financial planning has not been correct around providing infrastructure for streaming data and so on. And on the electrical side, it's very similar. You've got these EV, large-scale EV penetration, as you mentioned, the chargers that are out there. We definitely see that with our Watt Station portfolio as well, and the infrastructure is just not necessarily prepared for it. And I wonder, I thought about that. I tried to do that thought exercise. Could you imagine your charging station, suddenly saying, "Oh, sorry, can't charge your car. You're not going to have any range today because it's your local utility's fault." That would be an interesting analog to the two stories, and it's a similar case where the infrastructure is not keeping pace with the end-use application utilization of the infrastructure, and it's fascinating. I drive a Volt, and I was almost late for our Hangout today because I forgot my RFID card and I had to run back down outside. But I'm fortunate enough to work for an employer that provides charge stations locally here, and that's a big part of why I made that choice. Despite the fact that you're working for the electric group and so on, you probably ought to, but there's a huge gap in ranges, and you're right. I mean, when you start to look at your commute and so on, the range from home and the range from where you're going really does dictate, the connection to these things. But EV penetration still is tiny, and although there's a lot of charge points out there, if you look at it as a percentage of overall transport, it's next to nothing. And you can almost be cynical to say a lot of the sales and the the penetration of these things in California and others are to hit fleet targets on fuel economy, where you're still selling the SUVs and other vehicles that don't have very good consumption, but then you have a almost cynical investment in EVs in order to balance the fleet-wide consumption metrics. And you have situations where Fiat CEO recently asked people not to buy their 500e because they lose so much money on each unit. So I think we have a long ways to go before the EV market really plays out.
Yeah, I think you could be right, unfortunately. And a lot of it, I mean, there's a lot of different barriers. I mean, the charging stations are just one. There's also the human element of, we fear change. You mentioned range anxiety with the Volt, though. The Volt has got a separate little petrol engine in it, not directly connected to the wheels, but for charging the batteries. So range with the Volt shouldn't really be an issue, if I remember.
No, it's not an issue so much for that, but part of the reason you make the shift to an electrical vehicle is you want to drive an electric. And so I almost feel like I've failed. Whenever the range extender kicks in, I'm kind of depressed. And why is, the thing I really love about the driving the Volt is how quiet it is. I mean, it's just a completely different driving experience, and I don't think, I've heard several reviewers say the same thing. You can't understand until you actually experience it. And I'd say that's true. I mean, I find it just extremely relaxing in a way that commuting never was, because the entire tonal experience is just very peaceful. and it's very quiet. And often I drive specifically without any audio on just to enjoy a quiet environment. And when that little when the engine kicks on, it just ruins the whole thing, right? But it's more quieter, and so. But you're right. I mean, you don't have the same issue, and even the efficiency of the vehicle. Even when the extension kicks in, you're still looking at, I don't know what it is, like 40 miles per gallon or something like that. But I'm not a hypermiler by any means, but I definitely look at that display on a regular basis, and I think a lot of people do on how can you maximize your miles per gallon, and then this perception from a financial point of view that you're also basically subsidizing the extra cost of the vehicle through defraying your fuel costs. But I still don't know, and I'm somebody who would look into it, but I still haven't dug deep enough to look at my rate structure with PG&E because I charge at home at night, at the office of the day, and I don't actually know yet, is it more economical to use the engine or to charge at home at night? Now, philosophically, I'm charging at home at night anyway because I'm in Northern California, and it's nighttime's going to be hydro for base load and that sort of thing. So I feel good about from an aspirational point of view. But financially, I don't know, and I think that's what your average consumer is going to look at more closely. Is can they pay for the difference in the vehicle through the offsets in their the hit to their pocketbook? And I don't think the manufacturers have done a really good job yet as a user, as a consumer, of really helping to articulate those savings.
Sure, yeah. And some of that, at least, comes down to having the vehicles and having the charging structure or charging infrastructure, at least communicating with the grid. Having the whole vehicle-to-grid technology put in place, and that actually is a nice segue for the next couple of stories, which are around the Internet of Things space. And this is a story you should be familiar with, Jeremiah, around Wink's connected device arriving at Home Depot. We talked about this on the show last week, the $15 bulb that was being launched by GE and Wink, and there's the application with it, so you can control it from your Wink application. You've got a little platform there for several devices, and the whole thing now is it works on iOS and Android, and the whole thing now is available through this large outlet in the US, Home Depot. So there's that. There's a couple of IoT-related stories I just wanted to go through. So that was the first one. There was this one. This was a pretty cool one, I thought. We saw 2 weeks ago that Google bought Dropcam for $555 million. Basically, it was. And Dropcam is an IoT play around video. Basically, you can view video of your home remotely. You can use it for seeing who's at your front door. You can there's all kinds of ways of using it. In-home security is a good example. But there's this other application called Many Things, which does similar. Just you don't need connected cameras. You can use iOS devices, for example, or old smartphones or old tablets. Connect them using Many Things. And they can connect into Nest and Hue using the IFTTT application. So it's a nice way of wiring things up together and saving yourself a bit of money, and then having this similar to Dropcam situation and reasonably easy to set up by the looks of it. The other story I saw, well, there's two more stories. There was this one talking about how Samsung, Intel, and Dell have launched an Internet of Things consortium. And when I saw that during the week, my immediate reaction was, "Oh God, not another one." And Jeremiah, you'll understand that because the one that was set up by Samsung, Intel, and Dell is called the Open Interconnect Consortium. And it competes, apparently, by the looks of it, with the All Seen Alliance and also with the Industrial Internet Consortium, which, if I remember correctly, GE was one of the founders of along with Intel and I think AT&T and a number of others. So that's now, by my reckoning, 3 Internet of Things consortiums. I think we'll need to have a consortium to allow the Internet of Things consortia to talk amongst themselves. It's a little bit insane, to be honest. But that's kind of a facetious comment on my part. We do need standards across the Internet of Things because there's a lot of siloed things going on there. But we don't need 3 consortia to work on it independently. But the other stories that were there, I thought were reasonably interesting. The Many Things one is kind of cute. It's nice. The Wink one speaks to a consumerization of Internet of Things, making it a lot more available, I guess, is the way to put it.
Yeah, you know, I love what our colleagues in the lighting group are doing with the smart LED, particularly with being able to push the price point, to
that was
to a
phenomenal.
point.
That was phenomenal. Getting it down to $15, that was amazing. The Philips Hue come in around, I want to say, $39 or thereabouts, if I remember correctly, and that's on Amazon. So getting it down to 15 is huge.
Yeah, I'm excited for the Link. I'll be, building out my my house with them certainly, and not just because of being a loyal GE employee, but because that $40 price point was just too much for me. I couldn't, for what was essentially a hobbyist, thing. You doing the math on burnout. Still CFLs were probably good enough. Switching over to the LEDs was not something I was ready to do. But I think at $15, you've hit the point where the math actually works. And so I'm interested in that, and I love the smart component of it as well, is because the change, at least in comfort, and this gets back to the discussion earlier with lifestyle and comfort, is just being able to dim lights. I've got 2 small children, and one of the things that's a real drag for me is at story time, as I'm reading to my kids at night, we like to read, and turn off the lights, and it's very disruptive, and it's not a lot of fun to get up and turn off the light. And I'm sort of thinking, okay, well, that'll be a nice gradual. I'm thinking, okay, can we actually have a glide into darkness and that sort of thing? But it does get into a very human lifestyle dimension there, which also ultimately will help in lower electricity consumption, because we can set ambient lighting at a lower level, which will consume less electricity and help us to be a more sustainable home, which I'm really interested in. On the other hand, as you point out, just the explosion of competing standards, different ways and hubs that you're linking this stuff together. I think it's really promising. That you have the Wink hub, or the various things that are happening from Quirky and other providers that are trying to be open. On the other hand, you have sort of what Apple is doing, what Windows has tried to do for many years. And for the average consumer who doesn't have a degree in computer science, hasn't been a systems administrator, hasn't done this stuff for their lives, I think it's got to be just a really confusing environment to be in as a consumer. And on the business side, as you point out, now we've got consortia. I think in some ways these consortium are opportunities to create legal and business frameworks for parties to work together who may not normally work together, and that's useful. That's good just even on a peer-to-peer basis, to say, okay, now we have a connection and a relationship to other players that would have been more difficult to create out of whole cloth. And that's the good that usually comes out of these sorts of things, quite frankly. We're trying to do more than that with the Industrial Internet Consortium, to go beyond that and actually create standard test beds for the various industries that we support, and try to create that more open alliance. But the challenge will be in orienting each of these groups into protocols and standards by which you can have interoperability. And interoperability has been a real challenge for industry over the years. And if you look at the utility industry, we've been talking about canonical information models and object modeling since the 70s, and it's been an elusive goal that many consortia have come and gone. And you're right, we can do better, and we hope to do better in our consortium. But as you point out, there's many of these things. I'm sure everybody has very good intentions going in, and I think the measure will be the value that each consortium creates and what you actually deliver. And that's why I said the test bed efforts are very important to us, and I think that's how we should start to measure these consortia is in what kind of environment do you create for people, and by people I mean startups or other players to connect and really invest in creating a broader economic incentive and environment that we can innovate in. And it's still very early days on this stuff.
Sure. And the last story I wanted to bring up is one that I wrote myself on GreenMonk, and I don't often tout GreenMonk stories here, but it is related. And I put it up last week, and basically the story is called Ubiquitous Computing, the Internet of Things, and the Discovery of Sound, and it came out of a conversation I had with Peter Coffey from Salesforce, and the Discovery of Sound is an analogy Peter had around, let me see if I remember correctly, it was sound doesn't travel through a vacuum. You need air molecules to vibrate for sound to be transmitted. So he was saying if you were some kind of individual who lived in space, in the vacuum of space, you wouldn't ever have experienced sound. And as you start to enter an atmosphere and come across molecules of air and their ability to vibrate and transmit sound, you might come across sound for the first time just from the proliferation of air molecules, something that you might never have realized was possible before. And in a similar kind of way, we're starting to see a proliferation now of connected devices, and who knows what's going to come out of all of these connected devices? And there's all kinds of things. I mean, as I said in the article, back in the 1980s, no one would have predicted, and this was, the 80s was the outset of the mobile phones. No one would have predicted something like this back then, and the use of video and stuff on your phones and the kind of things we talked about earlier. And so with now we're getting a massive proliferation of devices that are always connected, always on, and pushing out all kinds of data around any kind of thing you can think of. We've got cloud for backing up and disseminating that information, and analytics applications for analyzing it. And it can be data, as I said, about anything. There's all kinds of possibilities on the horizon. One of the ones that intrigues me, and it's one I've been talking about for a while, and obviously you'll have opinions on this, Jeremiah, but it's the whole electricity 2.0 thing, the kind of connected home and having devices in home listening for pricing signals, for example, coming from the grid and adjusting their behavior accordingly. The kind of cars, anything with a movable load, it can be electric vehicles, it can be heating or cooling devices, it can be, it's obviously not going to be your TV unless you've got some kind of storage mechanism in home. But even storage mechanisms in home as well is another one that is going to enormously change, and the connected homes and their adjustment of their behavior will enormously help utility companies to stabilize demand, which will help them bring on more unstable suppliers, the likes of the renewables. So as I said, the whole electricity 2.0 thing that I talked about, I think is really going to come on in leaps and bounds in the next few years because of the Internet of Things enabling the kind of connectivity that we've been missing for so long. Jeremiah.
Yeah, I share your optimism for what we could do. I think where I struggle is that right now we're still in the sort of technology in search of an application phase still. And if you want to use the music analogy, I've got a string that I could stretch, between 2 points. I wonder what you could do with that, and I don't know how the violin was evolved or the guitar was evolved, but I think that's, if we turn things around, and you mentioned the mobile phone as the the paradigm, it was, what really made this stuff take off was not necessarily the ability of the phone to take pictures or the ability of the phone to be a computing platform, but rather, things like Facebook to share. and what that was is really just a mechanism for storytelling, which we've been doing, around fires for thousands of years, right? And so I guess my question is, and that's the design question, the innovation question around a home area network, around this entire space is, what are the applications that are deeply rooted in very human, real behaviors that will help that take off. And like I said before, when I read my children stories, that's going to be part of the connection for me on getting a connected light bulb, because it's more convenient. It actually removes a pain point for me today, which is it's disruptive to the kids to turn off the lights the way it is currently, and it can be less disruptive if you manage it another way. And I think that's kind of where we are today, is you see this proliferation of consortia and apps and platforms, and everybody's sort of in this field of dreams phase still, where if we build the technology, then the good use cases will come, and they probably will. But predicting that the primary app for Facebook would have been photo sharing and so on, that then gave rise to things like Snapchat and Instagram, etc., which has really driven a lot of the device innovation, right? That we still haven't seen those types of things emerge, at least in my opinion, for the connected home. I think you still have given me one of the best applications or examples of that, and that was when you talk about the change in demographics and older folks living on. And remind me what that is. So in the UK,
sure. So the numbers are in the order of 20% of the households in the EU are people over the age of 65 living alone, and the numbers in the US are not dissimilar. So with 20% of the households being somebody over 65 living alone, a significant proportion of those will have younger relatives interested in their well-being. In that scenario, for example, in my own case, my father is in Ireland. I'm here in Spain. I would be very interested to be notified if his lights didn't go off at 11 o'clock at night, and if he didn't, turn on the kettle at 8 a.m. in the morning. And that's very simple. We're looking for examples of out of normal usages or non-usages of electricity.
And that's a beautiful, very human example. There's a large-scale demographic challenge there. Have you installed sensoring technology in your dad's flat to let you know about that yet?
I haven't. I could do. I haven't needed to. I've solved it a different way.
Okay, but to that point, I mean, I'm again not trying to put you on the spot. I'm trying to illustrate, like, that is an example of a deeply human need that we have in a demographic change that as a species we haven't experienced. And if you look at Japan, if you look at Russia, other places, the overhang is even larger from a demographic perspective. And on the industrial side, we're experiencing something similar. We have a very bimodal distribution of workers. One of my customers calls it Gray 2K, that the people who know how to run the plant are reaching retirement. And the new workers coming in are in their 20s and 30s and are sort of digital natives, as we talk about. And that transition, I think that's going to be the opportunity to drive Electricity 2.0. That's going to be the opportunity to drive the home area network. And I think the use case you just illustrated, where we are now geographically more dispersed from our parents and our children, and connecting those worlds in an elegant way. You've seen really neat stuff come out on screen sharing, and everybody is their parents' systems administrator, to a certain extent. That's happened. I think when the same thing starts to happen for the home, then things will get very interesting, and those will be use cases that really matter. Unfortunately, today we're still kind of in the mud and sticks phase of this sort of thing. That gee whiz, I can change a light. I can adjust the lighting in my home, which is great, and we need to go steps to that. But when we start to really connect with what it means to be human, again, this is sort of thematic for the discussion today. Humans as sensors, how do these sorts of things help us improve the quality of our lives? Then we'll see it take off, and that's where I think you see it. Now, on the business side, we definitely see the ability to drive that more effectively in the sense that you can now start to achieve productivity improvements, 10, 15, 20% by looking systemically at that data and modeling at a very granular level, and now starting to play out different what-if scenarios and so on. I think that's one area where the technology in the consumer space, technology in the enterprise space, will be sharing a lot of the bidirectional innovation there as those go back and forth. Because you're talking about rule-based alerting, on the basis of a parent at home and a workflow around that. On one of your shows recently, you talked about the same thing, that iOS is now doing workflows around having children be able to do app purchases and so on. That's something we've been doing in the enterprise world forever. Your shopping cart approval by your boss, shopping cart approval from your child. I think that's going to be a really fun space to watch, is where we see bidirectional flow of innovation between business and consumer.
Yeah. We better cut it, Jeremiah. We've gone over the hour. Thanks a million for coming on the show. It's been really fascinating. Thanks everyone for your interest. The show is recorded, so it will be up on the Green Monk site sometime over the weekend. I'll get around to it. And we'll be back same time next week, and we'll catch you all then. Thank you.